Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. Today I've got another book review for you, and this one is one that is actually already on the media list, but I reread for a variety of reasons. We'll get into it in this video, but thought it was time to cover on YouTube. So today we are talking about penis inserts of Southeast Asia. And if you can't tell from me holding it, this is a very small book. I actually just sat down to try and film this with my other camera that died in the middle of doing it, but in the middle of filming I broke I didn't fully break the spine of this book. I messed it up. Maybe I'll put that clip in here. I'm very sad about it. But this is a very short, small book. I'm holding it here by its now very sad spine. This back half is the bibliography and this front half is the actual book. It's like 28 pages long. So super short, super easy read. As the title very much implies, this is about penis inserts of Southeast Asia. So this is about Southeast Asian cultures that practice what we would commonly call like pearling or genital beating. So the insertion of like small objects, frequently like pearls from oysters and mussels, or like different carved pieces of bone or stone into the penis. It also discusses penile piercings as an insert, so there's a lot of discussion of apadravias and ampelangs in here. The researchers for this just sort of class any kind of penile genital modification as falling under the same umbrella. So it covers both piercing and what we would now consider like a subdermal implant. So this is, I think, a very fascinating read if you are someone who is interested in genital piercing or genital body modification, or the history of piercing and body modification in general, even if genital piercings don't necessarily interest you. Like I said, it is very short, but it does overview how long a number of different cultures have been practicing these modifications. And the reason why I ended up rereading it, because obviously by the very broken spine of this book, I can't get over the fact that I just broke the spine of this book. I've owned this book for a long time. I've referenced it in a number of different pieces that I'm doing. I partially reread it because I am referencing it in another piece that I'm currently working on, but also partially for two other reasons. One, there was an argument happening in certain internet spaces, primarily on like Reddit and Twitter, that like genital piercings are this like new fad or new trend that people are doing. And there was this big argument being made by someone who has a very large platform that like it's weird and it's only modern people that are doing it, and like the reasoning behind it is super strange. Like they don't understand why people would mutilate their bodies like this. And one of the pieces that I'm working on is a bit of a response to that, talking about, hey, this is not like a modern trend or a new thing. This is something that we have been practicing for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. This book does a really great job of refuting that. It discusses like temporal distribution. So the like areas where they've seen it. The oldest datable penis pin appears to be in a bronze dog, the core material of which has been radiocarbon dated to the early 4th century AD. Although obtained in Southeast Asia, the provenance of the dog has yet to be determined. It is presently in the hands of a dealer in Paris. The Kama Sutra, which is attributed to 6th century AD or earlier, provides the oldest written reference to these inserts. And the Kama Sutra discusses apadravia piercings in particular, and I believe possibly also ampelangs. So we are talking about 4th and 6th century is how old we can date the usage of penile genital piercings back to. And this short but sweet book also discusses the fact that it is very likely that it was an older practice than that, but archaeologists aren't properly identifying the jewelry and pins worn in the piercings or the implants, and therefore may be mislabeling some of the objects they're finding that were basically body jewelry that people were wearing in these piercings. And part of why they published this is the hope that they can connect with more archaeologists and see about properly identifying these artifacts, because they believe that there is a cultural basis and like iconography and imagery and spoken word stories that would lead them to believe that this is an older practice than our current documentation of 4th century AD. So it's been around for a wildly, wildly long time. The other reason why I wanted to revisit this, and the other reason why I wanted to review it on YouTube, is because I've had a lot of conversations recently with other piercers and other archivists about the way in which we are losing our history in the piercing industry, but also our ability to do research. So very regularly when we are talking with different piercers or enthusiasts or folks within the industry, there is a mention of like, oh, well, you should do some research about this. We say all the time, oh, the history is really important, like you should learn where these piercings come from. But the concept of starting to do all of that can be really overwhelming for people. Like when someone just tells you, oh, well, you should research, you should know piercing history. Like, where do you start with that, right? Do you read, Running the Gauntlet and Modern Primitives? Like, those are very widely spoken about, and you can sort of start to connect some dots when it comes to more modern body piercing or piercing as an industry. There's resources like Sacred Debris, but what about for folks who are wanting to look further back into traditional cultural practices surrounding piercing? What about people who are trying to uncover their own heritage or their history in piercing, or the history behind the craft that they practice? Most of the documentation we see modernly is on more modern times, and I could do a whole video about why that is the case. But what about these tribal and ritual piercing practices? What about this, what we would consider more like ancient history or history of piercing as a practice, not necessarily an industry? And that's where things get very overwhelming, because a lot of that is documented, but it's documented by anthropologists and archaeologists and researchers. It's not documented in a way that is as accessible to many piercers or many folks, and it can be very overwhelming to wade through and look at 1,000 published papers on the history of tattoo and body piercing, all written in very academic language, which can be very inaccessible to a lot of folks if you don't have an academic background or understand how to read these things, and it can just be very overwhelming. And this, I think, is like the perfect place to start if you're interested in learning more about this history. And you might sit there and go to yourself, well, Lynn, I'm interested in learning more about this history, but do I really want to learn about penis inserts in Southeast Asia? And yes, it's freaking cool to check out our history. And if you at all think genital piercings are cool, even if you wouldn't get them or wouldn't wear them, it's cool to read about and learn about. And there is also an element of piercing as it relates to like pleasure and sensation in the body that we just sort of like can't ignore, or like political correctness piercing industry advertising away. People have been doing piercings for sexual pleasure and sexual function for a very long time. There's no sense in ignoring that is a facet of why people pierce. And rather than ignore it, if we embrace it and understand the reasons, even if it's not a part of the practice that is for us, we better understand the broader picture of body piercing and how it managed to spread around the world. But this is just sort of, I think, a perfect introduction to research. It's not very long. It's dense, it has that academic language, but I think it is done in a very accessible way. And the way that they have specifically put this together is fantastic. So it opens with an overview of what they're talking about, and like what they want to study here, a basic description of what they're looking at, of what these different inserts are, what the jewelry looks like, how they presume they were done. There are illustrations of like what they've seen as far as jewelry that people were wearing, reproductions of tools that were used as part of the piercing process, and reproductions of imagery that shows these modifications done. So really nice illustrations. They break down what we're looking at. There's a great discussion of indigenous nomenclature. There's a breakdown of the way that the language surrounding these piercings spread throughout Southeast Asia. There's a great breakdown of spatial distributions, like where in Southeast Asia we see these practices happening, and they sort of track how these practices may have spread. They believe that they were likely practiced in India for a while, pre-colonization, and then the advent of like Anglo-Indian is the language they use, and like colonization there sort of removes this practice from India, even though we still have documentation of it. And then from India, this practice had spread throughout Southeast Asia, and even with colonization, as this practice is lost in India proper, we see it begin to thrive in these other regions that it spread to. So great breakdown of spatial distribution. Interesting breakdown of temporal distribution, so like the time frame in which we see this. Again, they date it all the way back to 4th century AD. There is a section of medical complications, very brief. A section of artistic representations, so imagery that represents these piercings and modifications in like weaving and in prints and in sculptures. There's a long section of explanation where they discuss why people might get this done. The primary one being pleasure. They discuss the fact that most folks that they spoke with say that it was done to enhance sexual pleasure for female partners. There are some interesting theories about animal genitalia that may have inspired some of this modification. We actually know that that is the case for Indigenous folks in Australia. That is well documented there, that the reason why subincision or splitting the head of the penis was practiced in Indigenous tribal groups in Australia was from seeing kangaroo penises, which are naturally split, in emulation there. So there's a discussion, could the same thing possibly be happening in Southeast Asia? There's a discussion of various cultural rites that could have influenced this. I think the most interesting breakdown here is a discussion of the role of women in society. And they spend a lot of time talking about how the societies where these practices really thrived were societies where women tended to have more societal agency. So where there was occasionally matrilineal descent, where women often had better rights, where women had the ability to like freely pick and choose their partner, where women could leave relationships, where women could have property and money and be like very involved in the community, and have their own say. And the fact that these practices thrived in cultures where women had that, the researchers postulated that men probably underwent these piercings in order to show women that they would be the desirable partners. And in areas where that ended up dying out were areas that were heavily impacted by colonization, where women were put into a second class status. So in cultures where women have, you know, more equal power, more bargaining power at the table, men said, okay, well, women find these piercings very pleasurable. If I want to be able to get a wife, I have to show that I have value to her, that I can do things for her, that I can make her happy. And getting these piercings is one of those ways. And part of why these piercings thrived in these communities is the fact that women had more equal power, more equal say in things, and were able to be like, well, if you don't have this piercing that like makes things feel much better for me, why would I want to be with you? Women are reported to say that the devices are to sex what salt is to rice or food. It may be said that men without the inserts will not be liked, will be rejected, or will find it hard to marry, will be laughed at, or will be divorced if they refuse to honor the wife's request for an insert. They go very in depth into all sorts of different like reviews and reports about it. They do take an honest and unflinching glance at the fact that like a lot of these responses are given through translators, so there may be some miscommunication. It seems like the people who wrote this very much doubt that the piercings create pleasure for folks. They seem to be highly skeptical of that, despite the fact that they are like, this is definitely like an indigenous explanation, like it seems very universal. They seem to be very doubtful of it. As a professional piercer who offers these piercings, I tell you what, you know, it's a mixed bag. My clients have partners who don't enjoy these piercings for sure. My clients also have partners who love the piercings, and I have other clients who say that like being with partners who have these piercings was like the best thing ever, and they like think about that all the time. You know, there's a lot to it, but there's a lot of evidence that this is positive. But the last half of it, comparative perspectives, is like very interesting because it does really honestly take a look at like the research they've done and the information they found. They look at the way these practices may have potentially spread around the world and the way what initially began as these specific piercings or inserts have changed as they're utilized in different cultures, and the way cultural roles play a part in how these piercings are received and perceived. An explanation, or at any rate a partial explanation that is not already a part of literature on penis inserts, lies, we suggest, in a feature of Southeast Asian societies that has long been noted by outside observers: the autonomy and equality of Southeast Asian women reflected in their property rights, high rates of divorce, dominant position in the family, and widespread bilateral or in earlier times matrilineal kinship. If women are unusually autonomous in Southeast Asia, then it follows that men might have to make unusual sacrifices to win their favors, or might rationalize their behavior in those terms. In order to put this explanation in perspective, we examine all instances of related practice outside Southeast Asia, turning first to India. So they look at the way these practices changed in other regions and became specific to those areas through the lens of what does it mean for a culture to have more equality between men and women, and for men then to be willing to make the sacrifice to get a piercing that is painful, that does require healing, that does carry some risk, in order to provide greater pleasure for a woman and make himself a more desirable husband. At the end, they finish with unanswered questions, which I really appreciated. They ask, how widespread in time and space are penis inserts? We presume the literary sources to be spotty and wholly unsatisfactory if the practice was prehistoric. Consequently, archaeologists and museum creators may be able to shed more important light on this question. A follow-up is also, were penis inserts really employed in India? If so, it seems entirely likely that art historians of India should be able to point to and maybe date representations of these inserts or pins. At the same time, examples of penis inserts from archaeologists and museum creators should be able to be located. If the practice did occur in India, that is, if the reference in the Kama Sutra to southern countries actually refers to Southeast Asia, then the practice may be one of very few cultural traits distinctive of Southeast Asia. They want to know if these inserts are traditional anywhere outside of Southeast Asia and ancient India, and track that further. And they want to know, are these actually desired by women? Are the inserts, particularly pins, actually used? And since male misunderstanding of female sexuality is common, as is female misunderstanding of male, it should not be certain that the most common explanation of penis inserts should be accepted at face value. This, I think, sort of feeds into their doubt about this. Like, they let folks know that, like, many people have done interviews and heard this feedback, but it was personal communication and seemed casual, and want to know more details about that. They also want to know more about that history. They conclude with some summaries of the existing information, asking like interesting questions about the practices, and obviously curious to learn more. And so what I like about this is they include the flaws of their own research. So they acknowledge that some of their interview questions, the information they got is, word of mouth, through personal communications, through translators. There may be flaws. They acknowledge their own doubt and skepticism of the pleasure received from these piercings. They acknowledge a void in working with art historians and archaeologists to better understand what evidence we do have to understand where these come from. They acknowledge that they are not entirely sure if this is a completely unique Southeast Asian cultural practice or if it was more widespread other places. And they look at similar practices or comparable practices that end up spanning around the world. We look at South America, we look at indigenous North America, we look sort of like with a very broad global view. What I like about this is it's well researched, it's well cited, there is a lot of good information in it. It is short and easy for people to read, and therefore much more accessible to people who have not done big research before, and it is honest. It discusses its own biases. It discusses the flaws in its research. It discusses where more voids could be filled and what more could be done and what that might look like. And overall, I think that makes this a really great initial piece of research to do if this is something you're interested in getting more into or learning more about. Even if this particular subject matter isn't the focus of what you'd like to deep dive in, even if this maybe isn't culturally relevant to you, or as a piercer you don't offer some of these services, I just think in general, for the practice of learning how to research, this is a really great tool. And that's more of what I would love to stress in this video, is that we don't have to wait for other people to do this research, for someone else to write about this history, for someone else to document this and put this together. You can do this yourself at home. You can access this type of literature. You can read many studies online, either just like generally published or through Google Scholar. Like, the information is out there. People are putting it together, people are compiling it, people are researching it, and they're putting it together, and they want you to read it. They want you to read it and to understand it and to learn it. And the more we actually do that, the more we don't just share an infographic someone else put together on the internet or a video, and actually do the research and gain the knowledge ourselves, I think that is incredibly valuable for our practice, for ourselves as piercers, for our community, for our industry. And I worry sometimes. I worry that we're losing the ability to ask difficult questions, to do research, to understand the history, to know where things come from. And I want to encourage more young piercers and apprentices and front of house and managers and enthusiasts to not just watch my content or anyone else's content about this or content in general, but to do the research yourself, to pick up the books, to read the journals, to read the articles, to have this knowledge, to talk about it with others. But don't let it be lost to the point that people who have a big name online, who are in this industry or industry adjacent, feel comfortable going online and saying, this is a new trend that people are doing and I don't understand it and I think it's weird. And there's dozens of people agreeing in their mentions and in their comment section. And the people who are disagreeing don't have the knowledge to fully respond and discuss. They're just parroting things they've seen from other people, which is its own thing, but like, it's worth it. Research, learning our history, learning your cultural history. This is how we keep this alive. When we read about it, when we speak about it, when we honor that history. And again, I know that, research can be intimidating. I know that academic language and academia in general can be dense and inaccessible. And if you're willing to put in the work to try and understand it and learn from it and grow from it and share it, but you don't know where to start, I think this is a great place. I think it's very cool to learn about the history and understand where these practices came from so we can honor them more respectfully in our piercing studios. And I think this is just a fantastic place for people who are interested in this type of research and this type of understanding to start and get a feel for what to consider when we're doing this type of research. And then go from there. And I would love to see more people investigating their own cultural history and heritage and practices and publishing stuff and putting stuff out there about it. So, if you do your own research and you put something out there and you write a blog or make a video or make a post, send it to me. I always want to know more about this. This turned into less of a book review and more of me rambling about how important I think research and archival work and keeping the history of our industry alive is, but it's me, come on, what else have we come to expect from this channel? Thanks for hanging out for the latest update in my book review series. Many more to come, always accepting suggestions and things that you think I should read, and can't wait to sit down and share the next one with y'all. All right, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.